And what's going on, everyone? Thanks for tuning back in. Appreciate you joining me today. I'm Zach Davis. I'm excited about this one. We're making progress. I've had people in the last probably 3 or 4 years ask me all the time, say, Zach, you're teaching something that not a lot of other people are teaching, and it's been really a different thought from a dispensational world as to what you guys are doing with the text. We don't believe the same thing about the kingdom. We don't believe the same thing about Israel. And I've had probably 5 people send me the Andrew Iskar and Tucker Carlson interview, so I thought I would do a little bit of reaction to that interview, and we'll start here where he's talking about kind of what the Puritans believed at the founding of the country, and I'll just kind of give my thoughts on that as we go.
The people that actually built America, right? You know, the Puritans and all of the settlers of this country. You think of even like the founding generation. That theology did not exist yet. That wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that it came into being. Like, they were actually optimistic, right? They viewed, right, this continent as a place for Christians to build.
All right, so right off the bat, difference in worldview immediately. And all this is founded in the way you interpret the text. So what you do with things like the Great Tribulation and other ideas like that, especially the Olivet Discourse, which they'll get to in a little bit, it's really the bedrock for your worldview as to whether things are getting worse or what the point of the Bible is. Now, Andrew's postmillennial, which means that he's what someone would call a partial preterist, meaning there are things that he places in the past. As you'll see, he'll point to a coming judgment on the destruction of Jerusalem. And what he mentioned there was that the Puritans who were postmillennial, though probably a little different form than what Andrew is, they had an outlook of kingdom living, kingdom growing, and not necessarily that things had to get worse and worse, but actually that things in the kingdom, and really for them, probably politically and physically too, would get better and better. And that would be Andrew's outlook on this. And he states that the dispensational idea doesn't come around until the mid, 19th century. And I think people today who hear something other than dispensationalism say, well, what you're teaching's new. And his pushback and my pushback would be, no, you've got this backwards. Actually, the dispensational idea is what's brand new to really the entire story.
Dispensationalism, for those who haven't followed it, is normally criticized and defended because of its interpretation of what biblical Israel is now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a super electric topic, both
Very
theologically and politically.
Absolutely.
And people get utterly hysterical about it and start calling you names or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's that. But you're saying that a deeper problem with it is that it makes people pessimistic.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me give my thoughts on this. He's talking about the idea of people being called anti-Semitic when he's talking about the name-calling stuff and when they become furious and enraged. So anytime you hear someone today that says, well, that Israel that is overseas now is not the Israel that God said, those who bless Israel I will bless, that it's not that, physical people, then you start hearing the anti-Semitic language. And even in the right wing of the American political culture, it's the cultural norm and accepted you have to support Israel. My pushback, and I don't know to what degree or another for Andrew, so I don't want to speak out of turn for him, but what I would say to that is that the Israel that's there today is not the Israel that the Bible is concerned with protecting. I would say, and we'll get more to this in just a minute, I would say that it's always been about God's people that he would protect, and that today is the church. So the church, as stated in Romans, as stated in Galatians, those who believe, not of ethnic descent, the entire biblical picture takes you from a covenant of ethnic descent to now a spiritual descent, those who believe in the Messiah, born of the Spirit. So the Israel of God are those who believe, no matter what their nationality is today. So in the dispensational paradigm, you really have 2 separate peoples, one who physically, ethnically descend, they believe, though they don't have a lineage or any genealogies to be able to prove this stuff, who descend from Israel, so-called in the Bible, and then those who are outsiders, the church. So God's dealing with 2 different entities. And my simple response to that would be, friends, the church immediately, the church's first foundation was of Jewish believers. So Peter was part of the church. John was part of the church. James, Andrew, Paul, all of these guys, they're a Jewish foundation of this spiritual temple called the church. So the church is the place where the Jew and the Gentile exist together, and we don't have separate peoples of God. That ruins and destroys a lot of dispensational thought. So keep that in the back of your mind as we're watching this.
I mean, if you go your entire life believing that any minute the world is going to come to an end,
yes,
that I'm going to float up into heaven and my clothes will be here, and
yes,
and everything we're gone, it's done, it's over. Right. Well, that takes a people that ordinarily are very low time preference, that build things for the future, that delay gratification, all of those kinds of things, and it flips it around and makes them very high time preference.
Okay, so let's talk about pessimism and optimism. Normally, your postmillennials are optimistic. They think things are going to get better and better. Some amillennials and your dispensationalists, historic premillennial cats, they're going to say things getting worse and worse because the New Testament says things would get worse and worse. I would side with Andrew on that, saying they're going to get worse until the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So that's how you wind up with a great tribulation in the future, in the past, because it culminates that way. I will push back and say this, though. I don't think everybody that's premillennial or dispensational is pessimistic. I think there are plenty of folks who are doing great kingdom work and maybe contradictory to their eschatology or to their doctrine, they're doing that. So either way, I don't think everybody's pessimistic in that nature. However, I would say this. The church in America has failed at playing the long game because we want instant gratification like he's talking about. We're trying to recreate Acts 2 every Sunday, and there's no need to do that. There are people who will come to our church, and I know that they don't come back after visiting because they think it's boring. Well, we're building a foundation, and I want to look up in 25 years and see my kids' kids in church walking with God, ministering, doing the work of the kingdom. And that's not going to be boring. That's going to be a firm foundation that's been built upon. And that's playing the long game. And you don't see it for a while. You don't see that work put in. You know, you can't see the results of it as you're putting it in these hard years. But later down the road, you will. And that's what he's talking about. I agree with that. And I like that about the postmillennial mindset. Let me say this about my theology. I don't think that the purpose of the Bible, like Andrew, is for everything to get better and better to the degree that he would. I see things as covenantally progressing during the time of the New Testament, and now you and I are in a covenantally perfected state post AD 70 once all of these things were fulfilled. So that's a different story for a different day, but I do just want to kind of highlight some of the areas where me and Andrew would go in a little bit of a different route.
It's like, well, if the world's not going to be around tomorrow, why invest in anything for today? And you can even see this in terms of architecture, right? You think of the buildings that churches have, well, they're in strip malls or they're, they're
it's
kind of
garbage.
ugly.
It's
Yeah.
garbage.
Yeah. And you look at the buildings that...
It's like a former pet store in the strip mall.
Yeah. And you look at the buildings that Christians had before this was the dominant theology, and they're gorgeous. They're beautiful. And there were very poor people that made them, like you said earlier.
I know.
And it's like that right there, like you see it tangibly, that and you think about that in terms of all of life.
That is so smart. And what was the phrase you used? Low time preference?
Yeah.
This is probably a personal preference thing. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with building some big, nice, gorgeous churches, okay? There is. But I don't think any differently of the folks who are in the store in the strip mall. So, I mean, that's a personal preference point. I don't think that's a biblical argument that the church facility has to be something great, grandiose, and physical. That's never grandiose. I don't know if that's a word, but anyway. Not that you have to build some physical structure, because what's being built in the New Testament is a spiritual temple for a dwelling place with God. And that's the picture. Isaiah 66 says that God wouldn't dwell in things made with hands, but he would dwell in a house made without hands. And that's the spiritual structure, the church in the New Testament. So maybe this is a tangent I'm not super interested in there, but at least you can have my thoughts on it.
The whole theology was like laid out in the end notes. It's not actually in the Bible.
No,
it's like interpretation in the version of the Bible.
John Nelson Darby and Cyrus Schofield, and there's, they'll claim that they're antecedents from the early church. Like, well, this guy believed in something like the rapture, and it's like, well, it's always very, like you said, specious.
Yeah, that's my read as a non-theologian, but it does seem incredibly silly, but sincere. So, okay.
All you cats who are hardcore right-wingers, hardcore support Israel, hardcore dispensationalists, you got a guy here in Tucker Carlson who is those things, but doesn't hold that theology. So just letting you know that there's something different out there, and this idea of this imminent rapture in any second, and that your great hope is getting physically snatched off the earth. There are people who believe this differently. And I think it's amazing that somebody who has over 3 million YouTube subscribers, and this has been watched over 300,000 times at this point, just revealing this truth to a new audience and letting them hear a different viewpoint that, if they were like me, never even knew existed for the majority of their Christian life. And now they're getting to hear this stuff. Really remarkable, exciting to me, because Andrew's going to line up theologically in a super similar category to where I am. Not exactly, but super, super similar. Let's keep going.
But you're saying that the cost is even deeper because it changes your worldview and makes it very difficult for you to engage in the labor of, like, for example, loving people around you and building something beautiful, which are also Christian imperatives. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. And it also, so it forces you into an immediacy, right? We got to do everything right now because there isn't going to be a future. Right?
Yes.
There's not going to be, and I heard this all the time growing up. Well, we're not going to be around. We're going to be raptured. So why plan for the future? Why build things for the future? Why
heard that growing up?
Oh yeah. This was just everywhere in evangelicalism.
Did you grow up in that?
Yeah. I did. And I remember in college when I was first getting into more historical theology, or thinking like, what did people believe before the 19th century about things? and it's
for
like,
the first 1800 years?
Yeah. What did they? Well, there were various different eschatological schools. Like, there's all sorts of different views of how the end works. But when I first get into that, I'm thinking like, I don't know if I actually believe in the rapture. And I remember being in college and in campus ministry and telling people this. I'm like, I don't know if I actually believe in that. It was like I just uttered the greatest heresy of all time. Like, I could have said, I probably could have said, well, just denied the Trinity or something, right? And they would have been like, oh, well, that's interesting. But saying, I don't think there's a rapture. What? Are you serious?
Yep, some of y'all been in that world too, and you know that. So you say, Zach, what do you think about the rapture? Well, first off, I believe Paul was talking to his immediate audience. Andrew's probably going to take the rapture as a physical event. I don't know this for sure. As a physical event thrown out, not in mind in your imminent future, but at some point toward the end. That's a typical postmillennial approach. Not 100% sure on Andrew's take on that, but that's a normal postmillennial approach. I think it's a spiritual gathering that happened during the first century, which is why Paul would use second-person plural things like we who are alive and remain. So I think they're being gathered spiritually to God, those who were alive and those who were dead in Hades. So there's my 2 cents on that. I know that's crazy to some of you folks who are new, who have never seen this. This video might be the first one on this channel. There are plenty of things on here that'll get into more of those ideas further. Especially go look at some of my stuff in Hebrews 11 about perfection. Anything you see that says perfection in it, then go find that. Perfection, glorification, that type of stuff. That'll help you out on my idea of the rapture. So a little different than a normal take that you've heard. But, I think I can derive that from the text. I think that's where it's coming from. So obviously people disagree with that, and that's not the majority view as of now. But 20 years ago, somebody as popular as Tucker Carlson would have never had a partial preterist postmillennial come on and say the things that are being said right here. So I view this as progression, my friends.
Right. Like, that is central doctrine to many Christians. And it has this deep emotional connection. Because I mean, if you've grown up your entire life hearing this, and it's just assumed by everybody, right? It's hard to break out of that, even though the everybody of the historic church of millions or billions of Christians, right? It's actually a tiny minority in the history of the church that has believed that, but presently, it's a majority of evangelicals.
Yeah, it seems like that theology is dying. That's just my sense, but I'd be the last to really know.
No, I think you're...
Everybody hear that one? Tucker said he thinks that theology is dying, that dispensationalism is dying. And for some people, especially in the political world, it might take a cultural decline to realize that the theological bedrock was wrong. Now, that's not a concern of mine as far as how I got to where I am theologically, but what I believe affects my worldview and the way that I live, and as a member of Christ's church, then the church doesn't flow upstream from who's in the White House or the society. Society is downstream from the church and how she operates. So if the church has played no long game in our culture, then is it any surprise that we've struggled over the last 40 years in certain things, especially morally? No. We got to play the long game. And we better invest like we've never invested before in the youngsters. If we don't disciple them, then the world will. And Andrew would agree 100% with me on that.
Your instincts are correct. I think some of it is, some of it too, especially in the latter half of the 20th century, right after Israel is formalized as a state in 1948. Well, that gives like big confirmation that, okay, things are happening. Like there's an Israel in Revelation and a temple in Revelation. So it's happening, guys. So we've got 40 years, right? 1988, that's the end. Well, then that doesn't happen. And then people make all sorts of other guesses.
Oh, I wasn't even aware of that. So the idea was 1988 's the end of the world?
40 years after 1948, right? That's when the rapture is coming. That was I think there was a book like 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming Back in 1988. Right.
This is a super important point. If you've been listening this far, then you're interested in this, and I pray that you'll catch this. All right, the Bible predicts a wicked, crooked, perverse generation, okay? Deuteronomy 32 is where that starts at. Paul says it, Jesus says it, applying it in the New Testament, okay? A lot of people, dispensational world, believe that generation, which Hebrews tells us is a 40-year period, okay? It applies a 40-year period to the wilderness generation. It calls the wilderness a generation, which was 40 years. They apply that starting at 1948 when Israel became a nation again. Okay, they think that's the promised restoration back into the land of like Ezekiel 36, 37, that type of stuff. I would look at that and say, no, it's not about the physical land. The reason the land was important is because the land is where the glory of God dwelt. It dwelt in the temple, in the land. Remember when they were going in the Exodus and Moses said, Lord, if you don't go with us, then we might as well not go. There's no need for us to go to the land if your presence isn't with us. Well, the presence is no longer in a physical temple because God, Isaiah 66, doesn't dwell in a temple made with physical hands like he did in the Old Covenant. Now he dwells within his people spiritually. That's why Revelation 21 says the tabernacle of God is with men. And that's the picture in Acts chapter 2 when the Spirit lights on the people. That's part of the idea, some of that imagery that's there. It's like a Solomon temple dedication text, and we're heading to that reality by the end of the New Testament. So it's not about the physical land, which is why in Acts chapter 3 and 4, they're selling the physical land in Jerusalem because they know it's not the center focus of what God's doing anymore. It's all in the church and coming to a spiritual reality that God would dwell among his people in that respect. So the generation that's going to see all of these things, all right, is 80-30 to 80-70. That's your 40-year period that all this plays out in. And if people would take it and put it there where it belongs, where Jesus said it over and over was going to happen, and rightfully understand it there, then we'd save ourselves bad theology in the future, which is going to lead downstream consequently and affect a bad worldview, which is going to affect every part of our life and our society. So what you believe has consequences, friends. It does.
Right. And I'm sure it sold a lot of copies and then, of course, didn't happen.
Wow.
But
Mike Dukakis lost. No, I mean, that's not obviously the Rapture, but whatever, we'll take it.
For people in Massachusetts, maybe it was, but yeah, it's just so interesting because like I look at it like you look at Matthew 24, right? That's the big text that people point to. And
what does it say?
Where Jesus says, well, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes in various places and plagues and things like that. But right before it, right, well, Jesus is in the temple and he's fighting with the chief priests and he's telling them, he's fighting with them at Passover. So thousands of people surrounding them. He's embarrassing them in the temple. And
his boldness is really shocking.
Yes.
To people who haven't read it before.
Yes.
The rage that he displays at the leadership,
yes,
the religious leadership is just like it's
nothing else.
It comes right off the page.
And
here's my take. This is going to be new. Hang on to your shorts, kids. I say new to you guys who aren't a subscriber to my channel, who haven't been watching for the last 3 years or so. The judgments in the New Testament are coming on those who broke the covenant, the old covenant law. That's why Jesus' rage was so strong against those Jewish leaders, and he tells them that they're going to bear the punishment for their sins. They were filling up the measure of the sins all the way back from their fathers in Matthew 23, which is what Andrew's talking about there. That's the whole concept of the judgment. The judgment was always going to come on the old covenant breakers, which is why John the Baptist in Matthew 3 tells the Pharisees, hey, it's coming on you. Jesus in John 8 was strong and hard against them. You're of your father, the devil. Revelation 2 and 3 call them the synagogue of Satan. Old covenant Israel that rejected Messiah is Babylon, the harlot of the book of Revelation, who is judged. It's coming on the people who rejected Messiah, who were under the old covenant law, because this is the curse section. Those plagues laid out in Revelation are the curse section found in Leviticus. Go read Leviticus 26. Go read Deuteronomy 27, 28. You will find all of them there. Coming on those when the first century, when the old covenant still existed in the first century. The old covenant's not around today. Those covenant cursings can't be poured out in mine in your future. And if those covenant cursings weren't poured out in full, then the old covenant would still be around today. So this is why we point all of this, the Bible does, to AD 70 and the destruction of the temple in the first century. And Andrew's all over this. And I think there are things that Tucker's still exploring. Self-expressly said he's not a theologian, though I think he probably is a little more than he gives himself credit for. But this is super important for a lot of you guys who this is new to hear.
And which is so ironic because you see evangelicals who are like, you need to be more Christ-like, right? You need to be, which means like wimpy and weak and inoffensive.
Sweeping into the temple and knocking over tables and driving people out with a whip.
And then going into the temple and giving this parable, right, where of the vineyard, right? He's like, first I sent this servant, you beat him and stoned him, and then you killed another one. Well, I'll send my son. And they'll respect him. And then it's the heir, right? If we kill him, we could take the vineyard for ourselves, right? And he asked him, what's he going to do to these people? Well, he's going to come and he's going to destroy all of them. And it's like, and they knew, right? The hilarious thing, I think, like reading the Gospels is, right, Jesus is giving parables, and the point of the parables is actually to conceal what he's saying. And people are like, whoa, what's that? Even his own disciples are like, what's that about? I don't really know. Like, it doesn't make any sense. But he's telling parables to the chief priests and the Pharisees and all the leaders of Israel, and they're like, oh, that's about us.
Notice when he's talking about how the disciples didn't understand it. Okay, they didn't yet. Jesus rises from the dead in Luke chapter 24, and he's on the road to Emmaus, and he explains to them, and he says that everything in the Old Testament pointed to him and to his day. So beginning with Moses, which is going to be Genesis, and all the prophets, all the way to Malachi. So everything in the Old Testament points to Jesus. Now let me ask you guys this. The religious leaders understood that judgment was coming upon them. Have you ever asked yourself, why in the world does the New Testament quote from the Old Testament so much? Here's why. Because something happened after Jesus rose from the dead, and the Spirit came in Acts chapter 2. Those dumb disciples that didn't know anything, they realized, hey, this is exactly what was predicted. Peter says it in his sermon in Acts chapter 3 at Pentecost. Paul says it in Acts chapter 24 and 26, 2 different times in 2 chapters. He says, I teach nothing other than the hope of Israel found in the law and the prophets. Everything Paul taught was based from the Old Testament. Everything Jesus taught, based on the Old Testament, fulfilling it. Everything Peter taught, based on the Old Testament and fulfilling it. When you understand that, you will read the Bible differently. Any doctrine that you can contrive, conceive, whatever word you want to use, you can go back to the Old Testament and find it. Now, hear me out. This doesn't mean that the disciples in the first century, the apostles, didn't have further revelation of said things that were going to happen. So Daniel would receive things, and Daniel receives it in part, and later, in full, John's going to see a more expanded version of what Daniel saw. So I'm not saying that they didn't have more knowledge. Daniel 12:4 said that knowledge would increase. And that's not talking about computers and internet. That's talking about the knowledge of the salvific and revelatory plan that God was going to give. Okay? So the closer we get to the end of the Bible, the more we should understand. Why? Because God was revealing it to his apostles, what he was about to bring to pass at the end of that generation, which was going to be full salvation for everyone from the beginning to that time who had believed, and consequently, those would have full salvation from AD 70 to the future, okay, us. So as soon as I believe now, I have salvation in full, all right? Remember in 1 Corinthians 13 when Paul said, now we see him in a mirror dimly? They didn't have the full, complete perfection that they were going to get once the law fully passed and was fully fulfilled in AD 70. You and I have that as soon as we believe now. Okay, so that's a different thought for some of you guys, and that's new, but that's what the Bible is trying to accomplish. It's trying to accomplish through Christ men who are fully back into the presence of God. It was Israel's goal and job in the first place to be a light to the world. They failed, so God brings about a new Israel who is Christ. He relives their history in the book of Matthew, as Andrew says at one point in this, and I think he's reading a guy named Peter Lightheart. And then those people who failed at that task and rejected God, they're judged. And that's what the judgment in the book of Revelation is pointing to. What's in Matthew and the Old Testament is all pointing you to that judgment, those prophetic texts about the end. Not the end of time. The Bible never speaks about the end of time. The Bible only speaks about the time of the end. About a time where it would be a greater judgment than the world had ever seen. And the world there is the covenant world who would be destroyed. She'd been judged and banished out of the land in Babylon in Assyrian captivity, but that old covenant had never fully been removed and destroyed like it was in AD 70. You'll say to this mountain, move. What mountain? The mountain that the temple stood on. You'll say to this mountain, moved, and it'll be tossed and thrown into the sea. It'll lose its covenantal reference, the land. It'll be thrown into the sea where the Gentiles were. All right, just a touch more, and we'll wrap this up.
I think it says they understood it was about them.
They knew.
And
it
they
does.
decided to kill him.
Yeah, so the parables are like obscure to everybody else, but when it's about them, like, oh, he's talking about us, right? But talk about speaking truth to power. I mean, like, I don't know how that Jesus was kept from me as a lifelong churchgoer. I have no idea. Yeah. But you just read it. I would recommend everyone read it, non-Christians alike. But he's there. He's right there. And especially the Gospel of Matthew. I love it because it is...
But Mark too.
Yeah, all four. I mean, obviously all four of them, but like Matthew in particular is so cool to me because like you read it and the way it's organized is Jesus is recapitulating the entire history of Israel, right? So right in the very beginning, he goes out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, right? Just like Israel's in the wilderness for 40 years, right? Is tempted by Satan. He comes, right, after he crosses is baptized in the Jordan, is like crossing the Red Sea, goes into the wilderness. Then after that, right, he's preaching a sermon on a mountain, expounding the law, which is Moses on Sinai, right? And after this, he's telling parables of the kingdom, like he's David, or like he's Solomon, writing Proverbs, writing Psalms. And then he begins all of these excoriations of the high priesthood and the Pharisees and all the leaders of Israel. Well, what's that like? It's like the prophets, right? So he's reliving the whole history of Israel in his lifetime. What's Matthew doing there? What's the Holy Spirit doing there? It's showing that Jesus is Israel. Right?
That's a good place to end it. I'd highly encourage you checking this interview out. It's super good. The fact that this is to the masses and that people are being exposed to this it's awesome. It's remarkable. It's a move of God. We're heading in the right direction theologically, which at some point, maybe 100 years from now, will affect our culture and societies who are built on a better theology, because society flows downstream from theology and the church. I fully believe that. And when we plan for the future, then things matter. This interview is awesome. I'll attach a link down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel here if you appreciate what's going on. I have a lot of biblical teaching that's on here. I post all of my sermons, any kind of little teachings I do just sitting here at the desk, any kind of Sunday school lesson, Wednesday night, a lot of that stuff is on here. So make sure you check that out. I do some interviews and some reactionary stuff, but mainly it's a lot of my teaching here at the church, First Baptist Church in Mark Tree, Arkansas. Come visit us, check us out, and have a lot of folks that drop by. Good to see you, and thanks for being on the channel today. You can become a member on YouTube or Patreon. Support us there, and don't forget to like, subscribe, share. God bless. We'll see you soon.